I didn't run because I broke the law. I ran because I was carrying a child two rival packs believed belonged to them. The first cramp hit just as I crossed the old timber bridge at the edge of Greywood territory, the kind of sharp, breath-stealing pain that made me stop and grip the cold railing until it passed, my other hand instinctively resting over the gentle curve of my stomach, as if I could shield the tiny life inside me from everything waiting on the other side of that river. At 23 years old, I was supposed to be finishing my apprenticeship as a pack medic, not measuring my escape in miles and heartbeats, not calculating how far a pregnant Omega could travel on foot before exhaustion won, not wondering if the father of my child would be the one to find me first or the men my own pack had sent to bring me back for my own protection. The air smelled like early fall, pine sap and wet leaves, the familiar comfort of home, except it didn't feel like home anymore. Not after the council stopped calling me Ethan and started calling me the carrier. Not after they started talking about my baby like a future asset instead of a person. Not after I realized the safest place for my child might be nowhere either pack could reach. I adjusted the strap of my small duffel bag, the only thing I'd allowed myself to take, a change of clothes, prenatal vitamins, an old ultrasound print folded into my wallet, proof that this wasn't politics to me. This was real. This was my son or daughter, my responsibility, my promise. I had almost made it to the county road when I sensed the first presence behind me, not close enough to panic, but close enough to remind me I wasn't as invisible as I wanted to be, and for a second fear tried to crawl up my spine before I forced myself to breathe slowly the way Mara taught me. For seconds in, for seconds out, stay calm for the baby, always for the baby. People think courage feels like strength, but most of the time it just feels like being too scared to stop moving. I didn't always live like this. A few months ago, my biggest worry was whether I'd pass my certification exam and if I could ever afford my own apartment off pack land, something small, maybe 600 square feet, with a window that got real morning sunlight. Back then, Rowan Blackwood was just a name people said with tight jaws and careful voices, the alpha raised to lead the rival pack across the river, the man I was taught to avoid, the man I definitely wasn't supposed to know personally. If someone had told me then that his child would be the reason I'd lose my place in my own home, I would have laughed, because enemies stay enemies, lines stay lines, and rules exist for a reason. But life doesn't care about rules the way packs do. Another cramp tightened low in my abdomen. Not dangerous, just a warning, a reminder that I wasn't alone even out here, that every decision I made now belonged to two hearts instead of one, and I whispered softly, more to steady myself than anything else. I've got you. I promise. No one's going to decide your future but me. The wind moved through the trees, carrying distant scents I tried not to identify, because if I let myself think about who might be following me, I might freeze, and freezing wasn't an option anymore. Somewhere out there was Rowan, and somewhere behind me were the people I used to trust, and between them was me, an Omega who had finally realized that protecting my child might mean walking away from everything I had ever known. The truth is, I was not always afraid of Rowan Blackwood. Before everything changed, he was just a shadow on the edge of stories told around our pack house fireplace, the kind of alpha parents used as a warning when they wanted their children to stay close to home, a name tied to discipline, ambition, and a territory that bordered ours along 30 miles of dense forest and winding rivers. We grew up believing the line between our lands was permanent, something older than any of us, something we were not supposed to question. I first saw him in person on a cloudy afternoon in late March, the kind of day where winter had not fully let go and spring had not fully arrived, when both packs showed up at the neutral trading post 10 miles outside Greywood to exchange medical supplies and farming contracts like we did every year. I was there because Mara wanted me to observe how negotiations worked, telling me that healing was not just about medicine, but about understanding the people who needed it. He stood taller than I expected, calm, composed, his presence quiet rather than loud, the kind of leadership that did not need to announce itself. And when his eyes passed over the crowd, they did not linger on anyone, not even me, which should have been the end of the story. It should have stayed that simple. Months later, everything shifted during a late summer patrol rotation when a sudden storm rolled through the borderlands faster than anyone predicted. Heavy rain soaking the trails, turning clear paths into mud and forcing several of us to take shelter in an abandoned ranger station that sat exactly between both territories, a place neither side truly owned. I was inside first, trying to dry medical bandages near an old iron stove, when the door opened again and Rowan stepped in alone, equally surprised to see me, equally aware that neither of us had planned that meeting. There was no hostility, only a strange stillness. Two people raised to expect conflict, realizing there was nothing to fight about in that moment. Just rain hitting the roof and the distant sound of thunder rolling across the hills. We spoke carefully at first, polite, distant, the way two professionals might speak if they forgot they were supposed to be enemies. And I remember being caught off guard when he asked about my studies instead of my loyalty, as if he saw a person before he saw a pack symbol. Time moved differently in that cabin, measured in the ticking of cooling metal and the soft rhythm of rain. And when the storm finally eased, neither of us mentioned how long we had stayed there talking about things that had nothing to do with borders, like what it felt like to grow up with expectations you never chose, and how leadership could feel more like a cage than a crown. I told myself afterward that it meant nothing, that one conversation could not change years of rivalry. But the memory stayed with me in quiet ways, in how I noticed the absence of cruelty in his voice, in how I wondered whether enemies were always as simple as we were taught. When I later learned I was pregnant, that memory was the first thing that came back to me. Not fear, not anger, just that unexpected moment of understanding between two people who were supposed to remain strangers. Now, as I kept walking along the narrow gravel road leading away from everything familiar, I realized the real danger was not that Rowan was my enemy. It was that he might be the only one who ever treated me like I was more than the future of my child. I did not tell anyone about the pregnancy for the first 3 weeks because I needed time to believe it myself, time to sit with the quiet reality that my life had already changed in a way I could not undo. And every morning I would wake up before sunrise, sit on the edge of my narrow twin bed in the apprentice housing, and rest my hand over my abdomen as if I could feel something that small already depending on me. The test Mara gave me had been simple, clinical, just numbers and confirmation. But the meaning behind it felt larger than anything I had ever faced. At first I thought I could continue my routine, attend training, assist with minor injuries, prepare herbal treatments, pretend nothing was different. But it is impossible to hide something from people who have known you your entire life. Mara was the first to notice. She did not confront me in front of others. She simply asked me to help her inventory supplies in the clinic storage room, closed the door, and looked at me with the same calm patience she always had. She did not ask who the father was. She only asked if I felt safe. That question alone almost broke me. When I finally told her the truth, when I finally said Rowan Blackwood's name out loud, she did not react with anger the way I expected. Instead, she looked tired, like someone who had lived long enough to see how often young people paid for the grudges of older generations. She warned me that the council would not see this as a personal matter. She said they would see bloodlines, alliances, leverage. I still hoped she was being overly cautious. I was wrong. The council meeting was called 2 days later. I was asked to attend, which in itself told me everything had already been discussed without me. The long cedar table felt colder than usual, every chair filled, every expression carefully neutral in the way people look when they believe they are being reasonable. Caleb sat at the head, not as my foster brother in that moment, but as acting alpha while our leader was traveling. He spoke gently, which somehow hurt more than anger would have. He said the pack would ensure I received the best care. He said I would be moved to a private residence closer to the main house. He said security would increase. Every sentence sounded supportive until I realized none of it included what I wanted. When I asked if I would still be allowed to decide where I lived after the birth, the room became very quiet. One of the elders answered instead of Caleb. He said the child would need stability. He said the child would need protection. He said the child would need guidance. He never once said the child would need me. That was the moment I understood the difference between being valued and being useful. After the meeting, Caleb tried to speak to me alone, telling me he was only trying to prevent conflict, telling me difficult choices were part of leadership, but I could see the distance already growing between us, the quiet shift from family to responsibility. That night, I packed a small bag without turning on the lights. I moved slowly, carefully, not because I was afraid of being caught, but because leaving meant admitting Mara had been right. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, the pack house behind me felt less like a home and more like a place I had already outgrown. And for the first time since learning about the child, I understood that protecting this baby might mean walking away not just from Rowan's world, but from my own. I thought leaving quietly would give me a head start, maybe a few days before anyone realized I was gone. But I underestimated how quickly a pack notices when someone they consider important disappears, especially when that someone is carrying something they believe changes the future. By the second morning on the road, I began to see the signs that I was being followed. Nothing obvious, nothing threatening, just small details that told me trained eyes were searching for me. A fresh set of tire tracks near a gas station off Route 16, a question from a cashier about whether I was traveling alone, the subtle pressure of knowing I was no longer just Ethan trying to disappear, but Ethan being tracked. I kept moving anyway, choosing smaller roads, resting only when my body demanded it, reminding myself that stress was not just mine anymore. Around noon that day, I stopped near a roadside diner about 50 miles from Graywood, the kind of place with faded red booths and coffee that never seemed to run out. And for the first time since leaving, I allowed myself to sit somewhere that felt normal. I ordered water and toast because it was all my stomach would accept, and for a few quiet minutes I almost believed I could just be another traveler passing through. That illusion ended when the bell above the door rang, and the air changed in a way I felt before I saw him. Rowan did not enter like someone hunting me. He walked in like someone who already knew where I would be. His presence was calm, controlled, drawing attention without asking for it. And when his eyes found mine, there was no anger there, only certainty. He asked the waitress for 2 coffees as if we had planned to meet, then sat across from me with enough distance to show he was not there to trap me. I asked him how he found me. He answered honestly. He said he was not the only one looking. He said my pack had already sent people farther south. He said time mattered now. I expected him to talk about territory or rights or obligations, but instead he asked if I had seen a doctor since leaving. That question unsettled me more than anything else because it sounded like concern instead of strategy. I told him I could handle myself. He nodded but did not argue. He said he was not there to take me anywhere. He said he only wanted me to understand that neither pack would stop trying to control what they believed was valuable. I asked him why he cared. He took a long breath before answering. He said because he knew what it felt like to grow up being told your future was already decided. He said he would not let that happen to his child if he had any choice. That was the first time either of us said the word child out loud together. The silence after that felt heavier than any argument could have been. When he finally stood to leave, he did not ask me to follow. He only left a folded piece of paper on the table with the address of a neutral clinic about 20 miles west and said if I needed somewhere safe to rest. That place did not answer to either pack. After he walked out, I sat there for a long time staring at that paper, realizing the most dangerous thing about Rowan Blackwood was not his strength. It was that part of me was starting to believe he might be telling the truth. For almost an hour, I sat there turning the piece of paper over between my fingers like it might change if I looked at it long enough. The address written in Rowan's steady handwriting. Nothing dramatic, just a street name, a town I had never visited, and a quiet offer of safety that I did not know whether to trust. I kept telling myself that accepting help from him would be a mistake, that nothing involving 2 rival packs could ever be simple. But the truth was my body was already making the decision for me. The steady exhaustion in my bones, the faint dizziness when I stood too fast, the constant reminder that I was not just traveling for myself anymore. By late afternoon, I found myself driving west on a narrow 2-lane highway lined with open farmland and long wooden fences, the kind of road where you could see a mile ahead and still feel completely alone. And with every mile, I kept expecting to regret the choice, expecting someone from either side to appear and force everything into confrontation. But nothing happened except the quiet hum of tires and the sound of my own breathing. The clinic turned out to be smaller than I imagined. A converted white farmhouse with a blue porch and a hand-painted sign that simply read Community Health Center, the kind of place that looked like it survived on trust more than funding. When I stepped inside, I was greeted by an older beta named Daniel, who did not ask for my last name, did not ask about my pack, only asked how many weeks along I was and whether I had been sleeping enough. That alone almost made me emotional because it was the first time since this began that someone treated my situation like a medical reality instead of a political situation. He checked my blood pressure, measured the baby's growth, and told me everything looked stable, words that felt more valuable than anything I had heard in weeks. I stayed there that night in a small guest room with a narrow bed and a window facing a cornfield, and for the first time since leaving home I slept without waking up every hour. I should have known peace like that would not last. The next morning Daniel knocked softly on my door and told me someone was asking for me outside, and before I even reached the porch I already knew who it would be. Rowan stood near the gravel driveway, hands in his jacket pockets, not approaching the building like he respected whatever boundary this place represented. When I asked if he had followed me again, he shook his head and said he had only guessed I would choose somewhere neutral because it was what he would have done. Then he told me something I was not prepared to hear. He said his own counsel had already learned about the pregnancy. He said they were discussing succession laws. He said some of them believed the child could unify territories through bloodline claims. I felt that familiar cold realization settle in my chest again, the understanding that no matter how far I traveled, other people were already planning my child's future like it was a business agreement. I asked him directly what he wanted. He did not hesitate. He said he wanted me to have a choice, even if that meant choosing a life that did not include him. That answer stayed with me long after he left because I realized something important in that moment. The real conflict was no longer about which pack would claim the child. It was about whether anyone would allow the child to simply belong to themselves. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm that almost felt unreal, like I was living in the quiet space between two storms that had not decided when to arrive. And for the first time since everything began, I allowed myself to experience something close to routine again. I woke up early, helped Daniel stock supplies just to keep my hands busy, took slow walks along the gravel path behind the clinic where the land stretched open under wide American skies, and every step I took I counted not in distance, but in reassurance that the life inside me was still steady, still safe. Rowan did not return immediately after that conversation, which I told myself was a good thing, but I still found myself noticing every unfamiliar vehicle that passed the long driveway, every unfamiliar scent carried on the wind, realizing that part of me had begun to measure safety not by isolation, but by whether he might appear if things became difficult. 3 days later, I learned just how complicated everything had become. Daniel called me into his small office after receiving a phone call he could not ignore, his expression careful in the way of someone trying not to alarm a patient, and he explained that representatives from both territories had begun asking neutral medical facilities about an omega fitting my description, not demanding information, not making threats, just asking careful questions about prenatal care timelines and patient transfers. That was when I understood that the search had moved beyond simply finding me. They were preparing for the child. That realization changed something inside me. Until then, I had been running to protect myself. Now I understood I was running against a future other people were already organizing. Later that evening, Rowan returned. But this time, he did not come alone. A beta from his territory waited respectfully near the truck. Someone I would later learn was named Silas Vane, his second in command, a man whose quiet presence suggested loyalty without intrusion. Rowan asked if we could talk outside where the air was clearer, and as we walked slowly along the fence line, he told me the part of the story I had not known. He said not everyone in his territory agreed with him. He said some elders believed the child should be raised under their laws to strengthen their claim to leadership through lineage. He said he had already refused those suggestions. When I asked what that refusal cost him, he did not answer right away. Finally, he admitted that leadership was not just authority, it was negotiation, and sometimes refusing to use power the way others expected could weaken your standing. I realized then that he was not just risking conflict with my pack. He was risking his position within his own. That changed how I saw him more than anything else. I asked him why he would do that for someone he barely knew. He answered quietly that he was not doing it for me alone. He was doing it because he refused to let his child grow up believing they were born as a bargaining piece. The honesty in that answer stayed with me long after he left again. And that night, as I lay awake listening to the soft sound of wind moving through the cornfields, I realized something I had not been ready to admit before. The real turning point was no longer whether I trusted Rowan. It was whether I was ready to believe that someone raised on the opposite side of everything I knew might still choose the same future I wanted for this child. The illusion of quiet ended on a gray Thursday morning when the sky hung low and heavy like it was waiting for something to change, and I felt it before anyone said a word. That subtle shift in the air that told me the space I had borrowed was no longer invisible. Daniel tried to keep his voice calm when he told me 2 vehicles had stopped at the far end of the property road, not blocking anything, not approaching, just waiting in a way that made it clear they were not lost. I did not need to ask who they belonged to. No one drives that far out unless they are looking for someone. I stepped outside anyway because hiding would only delay the inevitable. One hand resting against my stomach without thinking, a gesture that had already become instinct. And from the distance I could see 2 separate groups standing apart from each other. One familiar in the way home always is even when it hurts. The other unmistakable in their quiet discipline. My pack stood to the left, Caleb at the front, his posture controlled, but his expression carrying the weight of someone who believed he was doing the right thing. Rowan stood to the right with Silas slightly behind him, not confronting, not advancing, just present. For a long moment no one spoke. It felt less like a confrontation and more like a decision waiting to happen. Caleb was the first to break the silence. He said my name the way he used to when we were younger, like he was trying to remind me of who we had been before responsibility complicated everything. He told me I did not have to do this alone. He told me the pack was ready to bring me home. His words sounded kind, but I heard the structure underneath them, the assumption that home was still defined by them. Rowan did not interrupt. He waited until Caleb finished before speaking, and when he did his voice was even, not challenging, simply clear. He said I was not something either side could request like a transfer. He said the only decision that mattered was mine. That was the moment I realized the difference between the 2 of them was not strength or authority, it was expectation. Caleb expected me to return because it was logical. Rowan expected nothing because he knew he had no right to. I felt the weight of both futures pressing against me, one built from familiarity, one built from uncertainty. The baby shifted slightly then, a small movement, but enough to remind me what all of this was really about. I took a slow breath and told them both the same thing. I said I was not going anywhere that treated my child like a future position to fill. Caleb tried to argue gently, saying leadership required planning, saying stability mattered, but I could see the realization in his eyes that I was no longer asking for permission. Rowan said nothing after that. He simply nodded once, not in victory, but in acknowledgement. Eventually both groups left the way they came. No threats, no raised voices, just the quiet understanding that whatever happened next would not be decided by force. That evening, as the sun set over the fields and the sky turned the color of fading copper, I sat on the wooden steps outside the clinic and understood something I had not fully grasped until that day. The real turning point was not that both packs had found me. It was that for the first time I had chosen not to belong to either of them. The next few weeks passed in a fragile kind of peace that felt borrowed rather than permanent. Like everyone involved was waiting to see what choice I would make once the baby arrived, and as the days shortened and the air turned colder, I began to understand that time was no longer something I could measure casually. Every appointment Daniel scheduled, every careful check of the baby's growth, every reminder to rest became markers counting down to a moment that would define everything that came after. Rowan visited less often after that day, and when he did, he never stayed long. Never stepped too close unless I invited him, as if he understood that trust could not be rushed, and I began to notice that when he spoke about the future, he never used words like claim or inheritance anymore, only words like safety and choice. One afternoon, he brought a small wooden box, nothing expensive, just something clearly made by hand, and inside was a simple carved mobile shaped like mountains and trees, the kind of thing meant to hang above a crib. He said one of the older craftsmen in his territory made it years ago, and that he thought every child deserved something that was made without expectation attached to it. I did not know what to say at first, because it was the first gift anyone had given for the baby that did not come with a discussion about bloodlines. I thanked him quietly, and that was enough. As winter approached, my movement slowed, my center of gravity shifting, my sleep becoming lighter, every small change reminding me how close I was getting to the moment I could no longer postpone. One night, a heavy rainstorm rolled across the fields, the kind that rattled the windows and filled the dark with the sound of water and wind, and I woke with a deep tightening across my abdomen that felt different from anything before, not pain, just a clear signal that the waiting period was ending. Daniel stayed calm, guiding me through steady breathing, reminding me that everything was progressing normally, that my body knew what to do even if my mind felt uncertain. Someone must have contacted Rowan because he arrived before sunrise, standing quietly near the doorway like he understood this was not a moment he could control, only witness. He did not try to take charge. He did not issue orders. He simply asked Daniel what was needed and followed instructions like anyone else. Hours seemed to blur together after that, measured in reassurance rather than urgency, in quiet, encouragement rather than fear, until finally the small cry of a newborn filled the room, clear and alive, and completely unaware of the complicated world waiting outside those walls. When Daniel placed the baby in my arms, everything else fell away. The expectations, the rivalry, the plans other people had made. Because in that moment there was only a child looking for warmth and a future that had not yet been decided. Rowan stood a few feet away, not reaching forward, not assuming anything. And after a long silence he said softly that whatever I chose next he would accept it. I looked down at the small face resting against me and realized something with complete clarity. No counsel, no leader, no history had the right to decide who this child would become. And for the first time since this began, I was not thinking about escape or protection. I was thinking about the kind of world I wanted this child to grow into. The first morning after my child was born, the world did not feel different in any dramatic way. There were no sudden revelations or grand declarations. Just quiet sunlight coming through the window, the soft sound of Daniel making coffee somewhere down the hall, and the steady warmth of a small life sleeping against my chest, as if that had always been where he belonged. I had spent so many months preparing to defend this child from expectations that I had almost forgotten to imagine what peace might look like. Rowan returned later that day, not with anyone else, not with news, just with the same calm presence he had shown since the beginning. And he stopped a few feet away again like he always did, giving me the same space he had given me since the moment he realized trust could not be demanded. I told him his son was healthy. He closed his eyes briefly when I said that, not like a leader receiving confirmation, but like a man allowing himself to feel relief. He asked what I had decided, not what we had decided, what I had decided. That mattered. I told him I was not going back to Greywood. I told him I was not moving to Blackwood territory either. I told him I wanted something different, something neither of us had been offered growing up, a life where our child would not wake up already assigned a role before learning his own name. Rowan listened without interrupting, and when I finished he surprised me by nodding like he had expected that answer all along. He said leadership was not only about holding power, sometimes it was about choosing what not to control. A few days later Caleb came alone. He looked older somehow, not physically, but in the way responsibility changes how someone carries themselves. He did not argue this time. He only asked if the baby was safe. When I said yes, he accepted it with a long breath, and before he left he told me that no matter where I lived, I would still have a place if I ever chose to visit. It was not permission. It was understanding. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were ordinary in the best possible way. Rowan arranged for a small house about 30 miles from both territories, close enough for help if needed, far enough to belong to neither side. He did not move in. He visited. Sometimes he brought supplies. Sometimes he just sat on the porch and talked about nothing important. He never asked for more than I was ready to give. One evening as spring began to return and the last of the cold air faded, I watched him carefully hold his son for the first time, not like an alpha presenting an heir, but like someone afraid to make a mistake with something precious. In that quiet moment, I finally understood what this journey had really been about. It was never about which pack would claim my child. It was about whether I would be strong enough to claim our future for ourselves. And as I looked at the small family we were slowly becoming, built not from tradition but from choice, I realized that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse the life everyone expects you to live and build a new one instead.